The first point I would make is that global recessions are rare. Recessions in individual countries or economic communities like the EU do happen with some frequency, but a global recession is different. It's usually the case that even when a large group is in recession, somebody else is expanding. China, the 1970s used to call the U.S. the locomotive. If Germany was in recession, somehow the U.S. could kind of power through, although the U.S. itself had 3 recessions between 1974 and 1982. But a world recession is rare. We had one around the time of the 2008 financial crisis, even though Australia did power through it okay, and certainly in 2020 during the pandemic lockdowns. But they're unusual. As I say, it's usually one group is in a little bit of trouble, but another group powers through and even can pull the recession country or group out of difficulty. But when global GDP declines, that's rare. We are heading for exactly that. To understand that, let's take a look at some of the largest economic groupings, and I'll start with the United States. Now, the United States had a mild recession in the first half of 2022. If you blinked, you missed it. First quarter GDP was negative, not a lot, about 1.6%. Second quarter GDP was also negative, about 0.9%. So first half as a whole, we had negative GDP. The rule of thumb definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP. That's the rule of thumb. We had that. It's in the data. Having said that, it was mild, and third quarter GDP and fourth quarter bounced back. But if there was a recession, it was mild. What I'm talking about is a much more severe recession, much more difficult, much sharper drop in economic output, beginning about now with rising unemployment, slowing industrial output, slowing retail sales, and importantly, for investors, a very sharp decline in inflation. So this is one of the kind of mystifying points about the U.S. stock market. I mean, it seems straightforward to me, but the market has their own dynamic. They're saying, well, if the Fed raises rates the way I described and they cause a recession, the Fed's going to have to cut rates. That's called the pivot, the Fed pivot, and lower rates are good for tech stocks or buy stocks. But think about that for a second. What if inflation comes down faster than the Fed thinks? And I think it may, by the way. I'll return to that. What if inflation comes down really fast and they get to the target rate sooner than they think? Does that mean they might have to cut? Well, it might. But what's good about that for stocks? I mean, if that happens, no one ever says, why did that happen? They just say, well, inflation may come down, interest rates may come down, so buy stocks. It's like, well, inflation may come down, interest rates may come down, but if it does, it's because we're in a very severe recession, exactly what I'm forecasting. And so if that's the case, stocks are going to plunge, 30, 40, 50%. So don't root for lower rates, or if you're forecasting lower rates, understand what that means. It doesn't mean the Fed chickened out. It doesn't mean life is wonderful and you should buy tech stocks. It means that we're in the very severe recession that I described, and I think we will end up there. And therefore, stocks are going to plunge. So, be careful what you wish for, as they say. My forecast is, they are going to raise rates. They're going to over-tighten. They're going to cause a very severe recession. And when they do, they may pivot at that time, but it won't be for good reasons. It'll be for very bad reasons, meaning we're in a recession and stocks have plunged. So don't buy into the Wall Street chatter as far as that's concerned. Because as I say, the Fed's going to over-tighten. Now, why doesn't the Fed know this? Well, because they never know, because they have the worst forecasting record of any institution I can think of. Their entire history since 1913 is one blunder after another. And this will just be the latest in a long series. And so just to kind of summarize, the Fed's on a course. We know exactly what it is because they told us. All you have to do is listen to them and believe them. They're going to raise rates, let high rates do its work, do their work, and see the inflation come down, and maybe in 2024 cut rates. What I expect is they are going to raise rates for the next couple of meetings, exactly as I've described, but they're going to over-tighten. The signs of recession are already present. The Fed's not looking at them. I'll come back to what they are, by the way. And we'll be in a very severe recession for a lot of reasons. And that's going to mean a plunge in stock prices. So if the Fed cuts rates, don't cheer too loudly, because it'll be in a world where severe recession, higher unemployment, and crashing stock prices are the norm. I'd like to finish on can't call it a happy note, but global liquidity crisis. Now, I talked about a global recession, and people go, well, isn't that like your liquidity crisis? No. A recession or a depression is very different than a liquidity crisis or a financial panic. They're two different things. they can and do happen separately. In 2008, we had both. In 2008, a recession or depression and a financial panic converged. So they can happen together, but they don't have to. They can happen individually. What we're in for looks like a global financial crisis and a global recession at the same time, coming sooner than later. Now, why do I say that? There's a global dollar shortage. People go, wait a second. The Fed printed $9 trillion, which they did in 2020. It's come down since then, but they did print that much money. How could there be a global dollar shortage? Well, what people don't understand is that behind the curtain, off balance sheet, this is off balance sheet. You got to go read the footnotes and understand what you're reading. There are $1 quadrillion of derivatives. And for those not familiar with the Q word, 1 quadrillion is 1,000 trillion. So I just said the Fed printed $9 trillion. Maybe it's down to $7 trillion. Yeah, but you have 1,000 trillion of derivatives, and they have to be supported with collateral. Not 100%, not even 10%. I mean, kind of 1% or 2% is enough. But when you're in a liquidity crisis, banks are extremely choosy about which collateral they'll accept to support this quadrillion-dollar inverted pyramid of derivatives. And right now, what they're saying, because this evolves, it gets worse. It doesn't happen overnight. It can become acute overnight, but it happens over the course of a year or longer. What we see, the banks are saying, I don't want corporate bonds as collateral. I don't want your mortgages as collateral. I don't even want 10-year Treasury notes as collateral. The only collateral I want are short-term U.S. Treasury bills. Treasury bills have a maximum maturity of 1 year, 360 days, but there can be 4-week bills, 8-week bills, 6-month bills, etc. That's the best form of collateral. It's the most liquid, easily traded, low volatility, easy to repledge. It's by far the best form of collateral. That's all the banks want right now. But if you're a foreign bank, you need dollars to buy the dollar-based collateral. If you want treasury bills that are denominated in dollars, you need dollars to buy the bills. That's why the U.S. dollar is so strong. People go, wait a second. The U.S. has a multi-trillion-dollar annual budget deficit, a massive trade deficit, 132% debt to GDP ratio, $31 trillion in debt. You're going into recession. How can the dollar be so strong? The answer is everything I just said has nothing to do with the demand for dollars in international foreign exchange markets. What's driving the demand for dollars is the need to get dollars to buy dollar-denominated collateral, specifically treasury bills, to post as collateral to support the $1 quadrillion of derivatives. And that's going to persist until the system crashes, which it's in the process of doing. I would say that the Fed's monetary policy will fail or is failing, and fiscal policy will fail, is in the process of failing, even if gold didn't exist. If you didn't have gold as a, multi-millennial monetary standard, even if gold wasn't there as a reference point, which of course it is, but these policies are failing anyway, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Whenever I hear, fiscal stimulus, I say, well, no, the Fed can print money all day long and the Congress can spend money all day long, but don't call it stimulus. It's not going to have any stimulative effect. We're way, way past the Keynesian multiplier, which is now below 1, meaning if you borrow $1 and spend $1, you don't even get $1's worth of GDP. You get some numbers, 70, 80 cents. Forget about the multiplier. It's actually now, a divider or something that reduces GDP. Well, you don't get the GDP for the borrowing. And same thing with monetary policy, because unlike Milton Friedman, the monetarists, the neo-Keynesians, the Austrians, and everyone else, money printing has nothing to do with inflation. And they seem to, well, I don't know if they ever knew it, so I can't say they forgot it. So all the money printing and all the deficit spending will not stimulate the economy. And that's true anyway, but gold is signaling that. Look, all markets try to be forward-leaning. Some do it more successfully than others, more accurately than others, but they try. I would say that, yeah, people say, the stock market is an efficient discounting mechanism for future events, for what they see in the future. And yeah, they look into the future. Here's the forecast. They pick out a discount factor, they present value it and say, here's where stocks should be today based on where things are going to be, 6 months or a year from now. And that's what they do sort of mathematically and analytically, except they're always wrong about the forecast. You got to get the forecast right if the discounting process is going to mean anything. So markets go through the process, but they always get the future wrong. They're not very good at predictive analytics. So this creates what I call the gap between the perception and the reality. Reality always wins, but not right away. Sometimes it takes a while. Gold, on the other hand, has very high predictive analytic value, number one. Number two, it's more forward-looking. So gold's kind of telling you where things are going to be maybe a year to 18 months from now instead of 6 months from now. And so, so gold is signaling that monetary and fiscal policy will fail and something else will be tried. And that ultimately will result in a much higher price for gold. So gold's just saying, well, let's do it now. Look, I've got gold at $15,000 an ounce by 2025. If I'm wrong about that, it'll be sooner and higher. But that's, well, I consider that a conservative forecast. And we can maybe take a few minutes to go into the analytics behind that. As I've said before, you've heard me say, I don't just throw numbers out there to get attention. I don't really care. I do care about getting the analysis right. There's a number of different techniques. And what's interesting is they all point in the same direction. So it's got to go to 3,000 before it gets to 15,000. It's got to go to 5,000 before it gets to 15,000. So that's my kind of long range forecast. But, it could go down tomorrow. And I'm like, I don't get depressed when it goes down. I don't get euphoric when it goes up. I know where it's going in the long run. That's the important thing if you're trying to preserve wealth and make money. Nothing wrong with making money. I'm all for it. But sometimes preserving wealth, and risk aversion is a higher priority than just making a lot of money in the short run. But either way, gold will serve that purpose and and preserve wealth over that time period. Could it go down tomorrow? I guess, yeah. But all the vectors are pointing up very strongly. And I'll give you a concrete example. There are three things that drive the price of gold fundamentally. One that you've already mentioned, which is real interest rates. The lower the real interest rate, the higher the price of gold. Number two, supply and demand. You learn it in your first 3 days in economics, but it still works. And then number three is geopolitical risk. Call it risk off or fear factor, whatever you want to call it, but I think of it in geopolitical space. Those three vectors don't all have to point in the same direction. You could have a situation where geopolitical risk is high, pointing to a higher gold price, but real interest rates are really high, and that would point to a lower gold price, et cetera. But right now, all three of them are flashing green or maybe flashing gold. The real rates are coming down. They're still high, by the way. When I always have to just roll my eyes when really smart people, Dan Isaacson, Bill Gross, Jeff Gundlach, and I admire them all and I follow them all. But they've all been carried out feet first on this bond bubble thing. The greatest bond bubble in history and short bonds, and the interest rates have nowhere to go but up. They're just failing to distinguish between nominal rates and real rates. Nominal rates are low. Real rates are not low. When I say low, I mean, show me negative 4%. That's a low real rate. You can pick your notes or your bills or whatever, but I usually use the 10-year note rate, 10-year treasury, because it's a good proxy for building, construction, long-term investment. People don't borrow overnight to build a building. They borrow for 7 years if they can, et cetera. So to me, that's my proxy for sort of economic growth and inflation forecasting. That's it's about 70 basis points today, et cetera. But inflation is, 1.5, take your index. So that puts the real rate, maybe negative 25, negative 50 basis points. Well, thank you very much. But, I remind people in 1980, I borrowed money at 13%, but inflation was 15%. And my borrowings were tax deductible, and the tax rate, I lived in New York City at the time, was 50%. So my real after-tax rate was about negative 7. That's a low real rate. So the point is, we have a long way to go. And it doesn't matter, people are interested in whether the Fed's going to pursue a negative interest rate policy, take the target rate on Fed funds below zero. Legally, they could. It's already been done in Europe and Switzerland, Japan, and a few other places. I don't necessarily forecast that. I don't think the Fed necessarily wants to go there. But you can have negative yield to maturity on a 10-year note. Just whenever the premium is greater than the present value of the coupons, it's a negative yield to maturity. So you can get there. You can get deeply negative rates in secondary market trading, regardless of what the Fed does. And that will happen. And so, in the DV01, dollar value of 1 basis point, is higher as the absolute level of rates gets lower. That's just, duration, just bond math 101. So we're going to have huge capital gains in 10-year notes as the yield to maturity goes, towards negative 1%. But that's going to be an enormous boost for gold. And we're not even there yet. We're seeing kind of a spike in gold prices when real rates are still, relatively high. They're only mildly negative. I was declarative when I said printing money does not cause inflation, and it doesn't. Again, I'll just use the last 12 years as Exhibit A. We should probably relate to the viewers what does cause inflation. And the answer is velocity, the turnover of money, the lending and the spending. But the problem is velocity is a psychological phenomenon. The Fed can stick the landing on money supply. They can get it down to a couple of decimal places if they want. But if you want to control velocity, which is the key, that's psychological. So what you have to do is change the psychology. Well, what is the psychology right now? It's deflationary. The savings rate in May was 33%. It had been going up. It kind of made its way like from 4% to 7%, but then it spikes to 33%. Well, savings is a good thing. You can drive an economy if you can convert savings into investment. And furthermore, if the investment is productive, unlike what China's doing. But we got some infrastructure or some other projects, R&D that would be productive. That can drive an economy. You don't have to drive an economy on consumption. You can drive an economy on productive investment. But the problem is twofold. Number one, it has a much longer time frame. That's a 5-7 year time frame. And it comes, in the short run at least, at the expense of consumption. Our economy is driven 70% by consumption. If you substitute savings for consumption, you're killing velocity. Because if I put my money in the bank and leave it there, the velocity is zero. And I remind people, $5 trillion or $6 trillion times zero is zero. You can print all the money you want, but if you don't have velocity, you don't have an economy. And so the question is, how do you change the psychology? How do you get and by the way, it makes sense to save. If you're unemployed, you better be saving because you're maybe lucky if you can pay the rent. But even people who are working or still have their jobs, they're worried, maybe I'm next. Maybe they fired the guy down the hall, but maybe I'm next. And maybe I better save more just in case, and so forth. So, and that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that doesn't make sense. That makes a lot of sense, but understand what it means. It's deflationary. It reduces velocity. It offsets the increase in the money supply, and it's very hard to get out of. I mean, Keynes called it a liquidity trap, and he was right. That's what it is. So how do you change the psychology? Well, you need something big. You need something dramatic that's going to get people to say, wait a second, what's going on here? Well, one of them would be a $5,000 price for gold. The bond market is telling a completely different story, by the way, and this is a little more esoteric, but if you look at yield curves, look at the Treasury yield curve, Euro-dollar futures yield curve, German Bunds yield curve, they're all inverted. Now, inversions happen, just meaning the longer-term rate is lower than the short-term rate. We're seeing something globally we've never seen before, and it is the best single indicator of a recession. The last time we saw anything like this was 2007, just ahead of the 2008 financial catastrophe. So the stock market's saying it's all good, Goldilocks, soft landing, Fed's going to get the memo, they're going to cut rates, the pivot, and buy stocks. The bond market is saying no. This is bad, and it's going to get worse, and it's actually too late for the Fed to do anything about it. See, when these inversions start, sometimes they're a year forward, like, hey, look at the Euro-dollar futures yield curve a year from now, man, that thing is inverted. But what happens is, as you get closer to the actual thing you're worried about, the inversion gets nearer and nearer. Now it is literally a month away or less. So that's like a big red siren, a flashing light, whatever you want to call it. Okay, whatever your baseline is, probably treasuries, 2-year notes or 5-year notes or whatever, they will come down a lot. Not right away. We may still be a month or two away on this, but they'll come down a lot. And then corporate yields will go up a lot because of the recession, because of deterioration, increased bankruptcies, reduced revenues, et cetera. So those spreads will blow out. And it's important to remember, interest rates are a lagging indicator. Everyone's like, well, how could interest rates be going up if we're in a recession? The answer is, as you get closer to recession, who figures it out first? Well, the Fed figures it out last. They're usually the last to know. Wall Street is second last to know. The people who figure it out first are actual business people, entrepreneurs, restaurant owners, dry cleaners, taxi drivers, or even medium-sized businesses. They see it. If you're in the trucking business, it's real time. If inventories are sky high and new orders are being slashed, you're not moving anything by truck. So there are certain businesses that are concurrent. The yield curves I was talking about are very good forward indicators. They tell you what's going to happen next. A lot of business people are living in the real world in real time. They know what's happening now, and the stock market tends to figure it out later. But as far as banking and credit is concerned, what happens is if you're a business person and you see business heading down, fewer customers, whatever, you go out and borrow all you can. You're like, hey, there's a really bad recession coming. If I got lines of credit, I'm going to use them up now. I don't want my bank changing the terms. I said, I'm going to borrow everything I can. And that creates a demand for funds and interest rates go up. And then the recession hits and the bankers go, what's going on? Credit losses start going up. And then they just turn off the spigots and they raise standards. They stop doing loans. And then interest rates will start to come down. Interest rates peak after the recession has already begun. So interest rates may not have peaked yet. Even the treasury market. So that's not unusual. Now, here's what the Fed is missing, or maybe everybody's missing. When you hear these layoff announcements, people are like, well, if they're laying off, why isn't the unemployment rate going up? Well, the answer is they have to announce the layoffs. There's all kinds of statute, SEC. So if I'm going to fire 10,000 people, I got to tell the world I'm firing 10,000 people. It doesn't mean I fire them that day. I might fire them on a rolling basis over the next 30 days. And it doesn't mean they walk out the door empty-handed and head for the unemployment office. I might give them 3 months severance, 6 months severance, et cetera. And so when do they actually show up to the unemployment office and say, give me a check? It might not be till this spring. So the layoff announcements are out there, but the unemployment rate hasn't budged because there is a lag, 3 months. But that's why I said interest rates lag the business cycle, and they do. Unemployment lags the business cycle. Unemployment is a lagging indicator. When you're an employer, entrepreneur, and you're in any kind of distress, not as many customers walking in the door, you'll do everything you can to avoid laying people off. You'll, be late on the rent. You'll turn down the lights, find a cheaper laundry, whatever it takes. By the time you get around to firing people, you run out of options. Like, I've done everything I can. Now my business is in jeopardy. I have to fire some people. And then combine that with what I just said about severance and, rolling terminations, et cetera. It's a lagging indicator. But we know enough right now to know that number's going up. But that's not inconsistent with the fact that we're already in a recession. It's exactly what you would expect, that unemployment's a lagging indicator. So when the Fed's on a mission, they actually don't care about the stock market. Here's what they do care about. They care about disorderly markets. And that's the key word. It's not, if stocks are going down, but it's, kind of little, 0.5% a day, 1% a day, trending down, lower highs, lower lows, trending down. The Fed doesn't care about that. They're not going to bail out the stock market. They do care if it's disorderly. When was it disorderly? Well, March 2020, at the worst part of the pandemic, it dropped like 30% in like 2 or 3 weeks. The fall of 2008, it was like somebody opened a trap door. The Fed does care about that because that kind of disorderly behavior can feed on itself and end up in a 1929 type scenario. So the Fed will get the memo, as I put it, stop raising rates and begin cuts when the markets are disorderly. That may happen. In fact, I expect it will, but we're not there yet. So there may be a pivot, in late August, or July thereabouts, but not because of Goldilocks, but because it's not a soft landing, it's a crash landing. So the global economy is in bad shape. It's going into a recession. Now, a lot of people have said that, we're going to have a recession as if it's no big deal, but they're expecting a mild recession. I see a much more severe recession. Now, the other half, what does this mean for financial markets? And there, the best way I've been able to explain it, imagine you're in an Irish pub and you got 3 Irish storytellers. And I'm part Irish, so I can talk about the Irish, but they're telling 3 different stories, and you got to listen to each one. So there's the Fed story, the market story, and then there's something called reality, what's actually happening. So stock market's telling us Goldilocks, bond market's telling us, here comes, Hurricane Mitch or whatever. And then there's what I call the reality, and I guess I'm the storyteller here, but what I see is a kind of a hybrid the Fed's doing what they're doing, right or wrong. Okay, they're doing what they're doing. The market has their own interpretation. I agree with the market, certainly the bond market, that the Fed has probably over-tightened, and they may pivot to say that there could be a rate cut in August. Maybe, I wouldn't rule that out, but for a really bad reason. In other words, if the Fed cuts rates, which they may, the pivot may be real. It's not because they engineered a soft landing and Goldilocks and everything. Oh, that's just right. It's because they screwed up as usual, as they've been doing since 1913. They over-tightened and they found out too late. And then they have to slam on the brakes or take the foot off the brake, if you will, in terms of rate hikes, and then pivot. And we've seen this movie before. This is exactly what happened in 2018. The stock market dropped 20%. I mean, it's like 19.9 or something on the Dow, so maybe not technically a bear market, but yeah, what's the difference? It dropped 20%. The Fed was tightening into that collapse. The Fed tightened on December 16th, 2018, only like 8 days before the Christmas Eve massacre, and after most of the 20% collapse had already happened. They tightened one last time. So what it shows you is that when the Fed's on a mission, they actually don't care about the stock market, this whole, Bernanke put and Greenspan put and all that. That's not how it works. So basically, they copied the World Bank, they copied the IMF. And I want to make 2 points. Number one, it's not like the BRICS popped up 6 months ago and said, hey, we're going to have a new currency. It's like Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland putting on a play. This has been in the works for 17 years. And it's typical Russian, Chinese. They kind of run a show, very methodical. So they duplicated the World Bank. They duplicated the IMF. Now they have applicants for membership, and there are, I think, 21 or more countries who have applied. Well, 7 have formally applied for membership. They filled out their college essay and they want to be members. And then another 13 or 14 on the waiting list, so to speak, and will perhaps eventually become members. But when you add those in, some of these will be admitted in August 22nd. That's the next big meeting, starting with Saudi Arabia. So what happens when you let Saudi Arabia into the BRICS, given the other members? You have 2 of the 3 largest oil producers in the world, Russia and Saudi Arabia. You have 2 of the 3 largest nuclear arsenals in the world, Russia and China. You have, throwing India in, and some others, you have about 50% of global population, 54% of global GDP using purchasing power parity. You can debate the method, but just if you do purchasing power parity, you get over half of GDP, 30% of the global landmass. I could go on and on. My point is that I learned development economics in the 1970s. We had something called the third world. It was Russia or Soviet Union and the US, and then there was the third world. And all you knew about them was they were poor, and you had to get them off the runway. We actually had the runway theory of how you grow. Turned out to be wrong, but that's what we learned. Well, this is not the old third world. These are not basket cases. These are many of the biggest economies in the world that collectively have enormous power, natural resources, gold reserves, landmass, population, military. And again, I could go down the list, but this is a bloc that is as powerful in its own way by a lot of these metrics as the collective West, which I would call, US, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a few others. So that's who this group is. Now, there are a couple other groups that may join forces with the BRICS. There's something called the Eurasian Economic Union. Everyone's like, what the heck is that? Well, the EEU was Putin's answer. This has been around for a long time. This goes back to the early 2000s. This was Putin's answer to the EU. He said, well, you got the EU, we got the EEU. Now it's Russia and some Central Asian republics, Belarus and Tajikistan. I'm not saying this is France, Germany, and Italy, but it is a group that have reduced tariffs and improved trade between themselves. And there's another powerful group called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the SCO, led by China. And these are mostly Central Asian republics, including Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and some others. But they're all talking to each other. Now, what's the common denominator? Well, it's basically Russia and China. China's a member of 2. Russia's the only country in the world that's a member of all 3. So through pretty simple inference, you could say, hey, Russia and China are running the show. And it's very likely that when this new currency plays out, that those other countries will join in. When you do that, And I found a really cool widget. It's a map of the world that's blank, and you can go country by country and fill in by color. Just click on it and give it a color. And I did that. And I was like, oh, okay, here's the BRICS, it's 5 countries or whatever. Well, here are the applicants, it has another 20. Here's the SCO, a few more. Some of them are members of both. Here's the EEU, that's a few more. Again, many are members of both. And you keep going, and all of a sudden, like a light bulb goes on. I said, that is Halford Mackinder's global island. What he called the world island. And this goes back early 20th century, first, probably greatest geopolitical theorist in history. Got to read his book if you haven't read it. It's pretty short. But he had this idea of the world island. That is exactly what they're building. Now, why is that important other than the obvious, which is more collective economic and population power? By the way, output of wheat, pick your metric, this dominates the world. Well, for one thing, if you're going to have a currency union, the more countries you have, the more likely you are to be successful. Why? Let's just kind of digress for a second. And what are the headlines saying? Again, you correctly said, haven't we been talking about this for 10 years? Well, yeah, actually we have. But in the past year, what are the headlines? China and Saudi Arabia are talking about selling oil for yuan. Brazil and China do large multi-product currency deal where they accept each other's currency. UAE, China, same thing, selling oil for yuan. Russia, China, using yuan and rubles as payment methods for whatever they sell to each other. Russia sells natural resources, China sells semiconductors, manufactured goods, and so forth. And there are a number of those. I don't have to list them all, but there are 10 or 15 of these. The reason they've all fallen short, and very few of them have actually come to fruition despite the headlines, is when you have two countries and they're going to trade with each other and accept each other's currency, and you can do that, you're limited to what you can do with that currency. This is why the Russia-India thing is starting to break down. Russia's been pumping oil to India. India's been paying in rupees, but how much curry do you need? I mean, and Russia's starting to balk. They're like, hey, we're up to our eyeballs in rupees. We need a better system. Well, when you have a multilateral, multi-country currency union, that problem goes away. Russia sells oil to China. China pays in BRICS, the BRIC currency, pays you in BRIC. But Russia can take the BRIC and turn around to Argentina and say, we'd like to buy, or Brazil maybe, and we'd like to buy some Embraer aircraft. And Brazil gets the BRIC currency, and they can turn around to China and say, we'd like to buy some rice. And then China takes, et cetera. And so you've solved the quasi-barter problem. You've solved the problem of what to do with a pile of currency that you really can't use other than certain goods and services, but not everything you want. And there's an analyst who's brilliant. I read his stuff all the time. I'm like, man, you're so smart. And I just really follow him very, very closely and give him a lot of credit. But he came out a few days ago, maybe a week, and said he'd heard about this and he was kind of dismissing. He said, you can't have a currency union without a common fiscal policy. And I said, I don't want to mention his name, but I said, have you not heard of the euro? I mean, there is no common fiscal policy in Europe. Don't tell me that Italy has the same fiscal policy as the Netherlands or that Germany has the same fiscal policy as Greece. They don't. They do have a central bank that issues the currency, has a little bit of gold, but not a lot relative to the size of the economy. But there's no common fiscal policy and there's no common bond market. To this day, there's no such thing as a bond, I'll call it a Eurobond, backed by the full faith and credit of the entire European monetary zone. It doesn't exist. You can buy German bonds in euros. You can buy Italian bonds in euros, but you can't buy a Euro bond backed by all those countries. So they don't have a common bond market, and they don't have a common fiscal policy, but they do have a currency union that's very successful. They finally have the scale. They finally solved this problem, which I described, which kind of is not, when you get two countries, you're not too much further ahead than barter, but with 30 countries. I was having dinner with a friend not long ago in New York City. We met at a place called Oriole, which is in Midtown. My dinner companion that night was a senior advisor to BlackRock. As you may know, BlackRock is now the largest asset manager on the planet. It directly manages $5 trillion in assets, and it oversees another $11 trillion through its Aladdin platform. That means one firm controls more money than the GDPs of China, Russia, and Japan combined. Anyway, my dinner companion happens to work directly for BlackRock's CEO. As we nursed our white wine and the evening wore on, she let something slip. If I remember her words, she said something like, "They want to tell us we can't sell." What was she talking about? Who was she talking about? I placed a few calls, first to my contacts in Washington, then to a few people on Wall Street. Soon I was on a plane for a series of meetings to London, to Geneva, back to New York, then down to South America. As I began connecting the dots, a pattern emerged. It revealed a network of more than 189 individuals positioned inside the world's major financial institutions. Some of them hold senior positions inside the IMF, World Bank, and every central bank in the G20, including our own Federal Reserve. These elites share one vision, and they're about to make it a reality. That vision is one world order, one world taxation, and one world money. They've worked for years behind the scenes preparing to realize that vision. They've literally rigged the laws of international finance. Everything is basically in place right now, and there's essentially no way to stop this from happening. When the crisis hits, they'll flip the switch, freezing the global financial system. That will give them time to reset the world economy according to their vision. As the coming crisis unfolds, President Trump will be powerless to stop it. In fact, trying to stop them would probably weaken the president's power altogether.
That is amazing. Jim, really? So what do these elites want from your contact at BlackRock?
Basically, they want to classify BlackRock as too big to fail. The technical term is Systemically Important Financial Institution, or SIFI. That designation normally applies to banks, such as Bank of America. If your bank gets the SIFI label, it means the government will bail you out first in a crisis. But it also means you must turn over control of your bank until the crisis subsides. In this case, they're trying to reclassify BlackRock, an asset manager, as too big to fail. If they succeed, they'll be able to freeze BlackRock when the crisis hits. BlackRock clients won't be able to sell. They won't be able to buy either. Their accounts will go dark indefinitely. And the elite operatives will take control of BlackRock's assets remotely via the internet. But our research shows that their ICE 9 plan goes much, much deeper than that.
You refer to their plan as ICE 9. You just said that. What does that mean?
It's a reference to the Kurt Vonnegut novel, Cat's Cradle. In the book, a mad scientist creates a new form of water molecule called ICE 9. When it comes in contact with other water molecules, it freezes them at room temperature. One drop of ICE 9 can freeze the whole ocean. And that's what these elite operatives are about to do to the world economy.
Now, can you share with our viewers exactly who these operatives are and what their ultimate goal might be?
Like I said, John, more than 189 elite agents have slowly wormed their way into leadership positions across the board. They now sit at or near the head of the IMF, the World Bank, and even our own Federal Reserve. They also control much of what happens at the central banks of China, Russia, India, Brazil, Canada, and Europe. As you know, these institutions form a kind of global superstructure. It forms a kind of snare net encircling all nations. Their leaders aren't democratically elected. They're not accountable to you and me. They're beyond the reach of government and citizens, and yet they hold the fate of the global financial system in their hands. To get a sense of how they operate, imagine an array of floating spheres. One sphere is labeled IMF. One is labeled Fed. One is labeled Bilderberg. One is labeled Wall Street. One is labeled central banks. One is labeled intelligence agencies. One is labeled media, and so on. The elites inhabit all of these spheres, and together the network forms a kind of 3D Venn diagram. As I see it, regardless of what sphere they inhabit, the elites all share the same vision: one world order, one world taxation, and one world money. All of their actions are geared toward moving that agenda forward.
Are you able to share the identities of these elites with our viewers?
We've identified more than 189 individuals who are in many cases hiding in plain sight. Regardless, they all share the same vision: one world order, one world taxation, and one world money. A short list would include Christine Lagarde, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, IMF; Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England; Raghuram G. Rajan, Vice Chairman of the Bank for International Settlements; Haruhiko Kuroda, Governor of the Bank of Japan; William C. Dudley, President of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York; Agustin Carstens, Governor of the Bank of Mexico; Janet Yellen, Chairman of the Board of the Federal Reserve System; Mario Draghi, President of the European Central Bank; Zhu Min, former Deputy Managing Director of the IMF; Zhou Zhouquan, Governor of the People's Bank of China; Robert E. Rubin, Chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. This A-list of central bankers and other elites is just the tip of the iceberg. Of course, not one of these elites will tell you outright what's going on, but I've seen and heard enough to connect the dots for myself. Not long ago, for example, I met with one of their senior operatives. He's a leading economist who served as the chairman of the Federal Reserve during the last crisis. He's considered one of the most influential minds in banking today. We met privately during a conclave in Seoul, South Korea. I came away from my meeting with him stunned and convinced that ICE-9 was real. Not long before that, I set up a one-on-one meeting with another member of the network. His name is Zhu Min, the former deputy governor of China's central bank. Until recently, he served as deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund. Zhu is a brilliant guy, like Bernanke, and he's pleasant and well-meaning. There's no doubt in my mind that he's also a member of the elite network preparing to impose ICE-9 on millions of Americans. But I wasn't done with my research. I have since met with dozens of senior officials, intelligence analysts, and former Wall Street colleagues. My quest led to a final meeting, a face-to-face summit with the head of Bilderberg. We met at Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, and he was very eager to get my take on the euro as a currency. I was happy to provide it, of course, in exchange for some valuable intelligence. As I say in my new book, he did not have horns. In fact, he gave me a nice gift when we parted ways, a blue Swedish vase. I keep it in my writing studio at my home in Connecticut. But my point is, I came away from all three meetings convinced of one thing. When the next crisis hits, the elites are planning to freeze the financial system, and they'll replace it with a new system, one not based on the US dollar. When that happens, we'll wake up to a very strange and disturbing new reality.
And for our viewers that are watching today, what might their reality look like that morning? How does this manifest?
First, they'll have gone to bed knowing that a massive financial crisis was underway. But when they wake up, they'll find it has worsened and the contagion has spread worldwide. When they go to withdraw money, their ATM will say, closed temporarily. When they go to sell stocks, their account will say, transaction not available. When they go to their local business, that business will only accept cash if it's open. As citizens realize they're being barred from their money, riots will erupt. It's going to get really bad really quickly.
How would such a freeze actually work? And wouldn't that be highly illegal?
Well, it wouldn't be illegal technically because they've been quietly laying the groundwork for years. They've rigged the financial laws, changed the rules of the game to allow this to happen. The stage is set. They have the levers in place. The lights are positioned. Now someone just needs to flick a switch and they'll impose ICE-9 rapidly. And again, all of this will be legal because they've rigged the system in their favor. Here in the U.S., for example, Congress pushed through something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. This allows the government to freeze accounts, assets, even whole institutions at will. The only condition is that there's some threat to national security with a foreign connection. Of course, with a global market, every financial crisis has a foreign connection. Any systemic crisis fits the bill. And the thing is, when the next crisis hits, it's going to be so bad, President Trump won't have any choice but to go along with the elite's plan.
You have to admit, that sounds somewhat hard to believe. Now, how could these operatives actually freeze the whole country's financial system?
Well, fortunately, we have some recent real-life examples to study. The elites have been conducting a series of dry runs for years, leading up to ICE-9. Look at Cyprus, for example. A few years ago, the Cypriot economy was in trouble, especially the banks. The IMF stepped in and loaned Cyprus $10 billion, but the loan came with strings. Now pay attention because this is precisely what they're going to do. But imagine it on a global scale. So in exchange for the capital injection, the IMF demanded control over the Cypriot banking system. More specifically, the IMF froze the entire system, literally every bank in the country. And they did that to ensure the IMF's demands were met, including strict capital controls.
Jim, these insights resonate strongly. Our audience surprises me with their understanding of complex topics when we discuss them. Many are well-versed in these matters, easily grasping the crucial elements available to those who know where to look. You've recently recorded an exclusive video discussing an upcoming geopolitical shockwave, a major development in global finance since 1971. You also offer strategies for individuals to benefit from this crisis. Regarding the economic situation, you've pointed to the Biden administration for depleting our oil reserves significantly, to passing all previous presidents. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine adds to these challenges. How much blame rests with the president versus supply chain issues? And as we're about 17 months away from an election, where do we currently stand?
It's a great list, Brian, because you can say, well, we could talk about the war in Ukraine. Yeah, we could talk about monetary policy. We just kind of did go through some of the recession indicators. We can talk about the election. But they're all connected. I mean, that's really where the complexity theory and the density of the network comes in, because these things are all connected. So just to spend a minute on Ukraine. By the way, I just last week I do this annually, so it's been 8 years in a row. Conducted a seminar on financial warfare at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And it is at the Army War College, but there are people there from all branches. It's a very elite group, handpicked about 12 students, mid-career officers. So they're kind of late 30s, early 40s, lieutenant colonels, And from all branches like at Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and a few civilians, State Department and CIA, NSA, intelligence community. But it's a fun group. 1,213. I look at the resume. It's amazingly accomplished. They all have multiple master's degrees, the occasional PhD, speak 4 languages, been deployed from Iraq to Colombia or wherever, but they've been handpicked as the future big brains. These are people. 5 years from now, there'll be 3-star generals on the National Security Council, etc. It's a fun class, and my topic is financial warfare, which is kind of like finance and warfare, which is what we're mashing up right now. And I spent a lot of time talking about this whole BRICS thing, and we can talk about that if you like. But I tell interviews like this, Brian, I always explain. I said I didn't say anything in the U.S. Army war colors that I'm not saying in this interview. It's not like I have a secret package for them and we do something else. I just say the same thing. You can take it or leave it. You can agree or disagree. But it's a great group, very interactive. But I was talking about the Ukraine war, and I said one of the most difficult things about this is getting reliable information in a war. Everybody lies, so the U.S. lies. If you ask me what has surprised me about the war, the conduct of the war, the development, hasn't really been a surprise. Russia was always going to win. Just question how long. It's tragic. But I'm surprised at how many warmongers there are in the know. They're mushy. Germany's between a rock and hard place. Hungary is actually against the no. Again, a little. Sorry. The US has the warmongers, I know that. But starting with Boris Johnson and going to Rishi Sunak, I mean, they're more bloodthirsty than the Americans, and they're the ones providing the Challenger tanks, etc. I don't quite get it. I think all these Chamberlain, Churchill, Hitler metaphors fall down. I mean, I know history. I know what Chamberlain did. And I know Winston Churchill was one of the great heroes of the 20th century. But I don't see that parallel. Are they doing it to try to get a better trade deal with the US? Is it that simple or no? Well, it disappoints me to see the UK act as kind of lackeys of the... It's sad to know it's not the heyday of the British Empire, but it's one of the largest economies in the world. Major financial center, nuclear power. I mean, it's not like it's a tertiary power, but I see what's going on. But I have to say I don't understand it. I don't see why the UK can't go their own way a little bit. But they are, so they're not. But not to get too immersed in the positive. You can pretty much lay the entire Ukrainian tragedy at Biden's feet because Ukraine would not. Russia would not have invaded Ukraine in February of 2022 if they hadn't been provoked for 14 years. I mean, going back to 2008. So what happened in 2008? George W. Bush stands up at a NATO summit and says Georgia and Ukraine should join NATO. He just said that. 3 months later, Putin invades Georgia. That's right. 2008 Olympics. So Bush says Georgia and Ukraine should join NATO. Putin almost immediately invades Georgia and takes the place over. It's like, were you not paying attention? Did you not get the message? And we had the global financial crisis and a lot else. So fast forward to 2014. What happens? They have an election in Ukraine. A pro-Russia, pro-Putin president wins. You can debate election. How high quality was the election? You can say, I don't like the guy, but he won. There actually was an election. And within months, the MI6 and CIA, working with neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine, and they've been there since the Second World War, overthrow the guy. They basically had the Maiden Square color revolution, so-called, which is all orchestrated by the intelligence agencies. They got snipers. They're killing people. The anti-Russian Ukrainians were doing the killing. And then the guy flees for his life, goes to Russia, and the US installs a puppet. Wasn't Soros funding Vice to go there and cover it in the central square? Correct. Yeah. And Victoria Dolan's behind the whole thing. She's got blood coming out of her mouth. I don't. So Putin's like, wait a second. We had an election. The pro-Russian guy wins. And you stage a coup, de facto coup, and kick him out and put in a puppet. So what does Putin do next? He invades Crimea or Nexus. Crimea takes it over. So it's like, okay, Georgia should join NATO. He invades Georgia. Ukraine should join NATO. We just had a coup. He takes over Ukraine. Are you not paying attention? You meaning the West, us, UK. Are you not paying attention to what's going on here? And then they sponsored anyway, without getting. They sponsored attacks on the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, etc. So by Putin's at the end of his rope now, yes, he did invade.
At a very high level, I would say there are numerous challenges and obstacles. We'll discuss all of them in detail. People attribute words to you and sometimes give you the reputation of being a pessimist. Jim Rickards is always discussing the apocalypse. which I do not. I never use that term, but I emphasize that despite the hardships, we don't have to be victims. We are not powerless. We don't need to withdraw from challenges. The crucial thing is to anticipate them. If you can foresee upcoming events, you can address them appropriately. You can navigate through them, not only preserving your wealth, but also potentially profiting. I frequently cite the case of Augustinus, and people might ask, who is he? He was an industrialist in Weimar, Germany, in the early 1920s, and he could foresee hyperinflation long before the middle class or anyone else. He borrowed a substantial amount of Reichsmarks, which was the currency at the time, and invested in industrial assets such as coal mines, vessels, and natural resources. When hyperinflation arrived, he allowed some time to pass, then repaid his debts. I would say he paid back a negligible fraction of the original debt, almost insignificant, but he repaid it while the currency was essentially worthless. He retained all the assets and eventually became the wealthiest individual in Germany. My German skills aren't excellent, but his nickname was the Inflation, signifying the Inflation King. There are other similar stories as well, like Joseph Kennedy during the 1929 crash. So, once again, we are not powerless. We can take action, but the key to empowerment, as I often stress, is anticipation. This is where thorough analysis plays a crucial role. You might wonder, am I more intelligent than others? Of course not. Many brilliant minds exist, but people often rely on flawed models. There's a lot of behavioral psychology behind it, such as confirmation bias and the belief that the future will resemble the past, which is often not the case. So, if you adhere to those models, you'll likely achieve poor results. It's difficult to think of an institution with a worse track record in forecasting than the Federal Reserve. The U.S. Federal Reserve, and perhaps the IMF is an exception, both have notably poor records. You could almost take the Fed's forecasts, do the opposite, and do just fine. There's more to it, but they tend to adhere to these flawed models. However, if you comprehend how the economy genuinely functions, understanding that it's a complex dynamic system, my approach is to apply complexity theory. Complexity theory has been around for quite some time, dating back to the Big Bang, the ultimate complex dynamic paradigm shift or phase transition that occurred around 13 billion years ago. However, the mathematical understanding of complexity theory emerged in the early 1960s. It has found successful applications in physics and other fields. I simply transferred it to capital markets, recognizing that capital markets are among the most complex dynamic systems, and adding human behavior to the mix further increases the complexity. These models work brilliantly when you have the right ones, but convincing others to understand and employ them can be challenging. Once again, the point is that with the right models, which should include behavioral psychology, a significant dose of history, complexity theory, and other branches of applied mathematics, you can achieve exceptional results. On the other hand, sticking with models like the Phillips curve and the non-accelerating inflation unemployment rate, as the Fed does, is likely to lead to errors. Does the future have some degree of resemblance to the past? Not always. In fact, it may occur less frequently now than ever before. Additionally, these models assume that prices change continuously. Prices fluctuate, of course, but markets don't always move smoothly. When they do, it often happens when you're not paying attention. When you are, they experience sudden gaps, either up or down. You might blink, and the market is at an entirely different level, having been revalued. Even though you can still enter or exit, you may have gained or lost a substantial amount of money in the blink of an eye. Considering these characteristics, and this is how I began to deconstruct the conventional wisdom, I realized that markets are not efficient, which is a flawed notion. They don't move continuously and gradually. They gap. If you're unprepared for this, you'll miss opportunities. Nothing in this context is entirely risk-free, so I started there. I began identifying the factors that, in my view, were inaccurately applied. You might ask, what resembles these characteristics? The answer is a complex dynamic system, the kind that generates hurricanes, tornadoes, lightning strikes, power outages, earthquakes, and tsunamis. All these phenomena result from complex dynamic systems. An earthquake doesn't sneak up on you. The ground suddenly shifts beneath you. Similarly, in financial markets, sudden and significant shifts occur. Therefore, I started to consider this as a more accurate model. Of course it is. Everything continually evolves. Another intellectual tool I use, which involves applied mathematics, is Bayes' theorem. Without delving into excessive detail, I learned about Bayes' theorem during my time at the CIA. I always say that if you have all the facts, a smart high school student can solve the problem. However, intelligence agencies and individuals in capital markets must solve problems when they don't possess all the facts. They have no choice. It's a matter of national security and defense or preserving one's financial well-being on Wall Street. You can't simply throw your hands up and say, "I'll wait for more facts to emerge." That approach doesn't work in the real world. Janet Yellen seems a bit detached from this reality. So, how do you solve problems when you lack complete information but still need to address the issue because it's approaching you? Bayes' theorem suggests assigning an initial probability and a priori assumption. You don't invent it, but you do your best, recognizing that you're working with incomplete information. If you have no facts at all and it's a binary outcome, assign a 50-50 probability. It's not precisely 50-50, but for a binary decision like red or black on a roulette table, it's slightly less than 50-50, but close enough. You say, it's either going to be red or black. I don't know which, so I'll assign a 50-50 probability. Subsequently, as new facts emerge, you update your model. Your probability either increases or decreases. If it decreases by a substantial amount, you discard that assumption, recognizing it was incorrect. You start over. However, if it increases, you're making it more likely that your initial assumption was correct. Over time, you can raise that probability to 80% or 90%, which isn't 100%, but it's quite robust. There's a crucial aspect to consider while updating, which was explained to me by Henry Kissinger. Imagine a simple graph where the vertical axis represents the probability of a specific outcome and the horizontal axis represents time or the amount of information you possess. Initially, at the start, you have little to no information, but you have ample time and flexibility. However, as you progress along the timeline, your information increases, which is a positive development, but you have less time and flexibility. Your probability curve rises while your time curve descends. When you reach the opposite end, you have perfect information, but it's too late to act. The opportunity has passed, or the crisis has unfolded. So, the goal is to find the sweet spot in the middle, which I refer to as the Kissinger cross. In this zone, you have sufficient information to make informed decisions and enough time to act deliberately. You seek this sweet spot, and with a touch of humility, it becomes a powerful tool. In the CIA, you never have enough information. You're always striving to gather more, yet you must make assumptions and forecasts because you can't afford to wait for 10 9/11 events to have a substantial statistical basis. You're dealing with the one event you have, and your aim is to prevent the next one.
Jim Rickards discusses the power of narratives in shaping economic behavior. He references Robert Shiller's book on narrative economics, highlighting how narratives, whether true or false, can influence economic decisions. Rickards refers to the Great Depression, noting how the narrative of frugality prolonged economic distress until a shift in mindset towards spending led to recovery. He emphasizes the White House's failed attempt to push a positive economic narrative, despite contrasting harsh realities, pointing out inflation issues predating the war in Ukraine, and attributing energy price hikes more to domestic policy decisions than geopolitical conflicts.
People hear the government say the economy is fine or unemployment is near an all-time low, which is actually, statistically, is true. They kind of nod and go, yeah, it's all good. And then reality is the stuff that hits you in the head, like a 2x4. You know, the propaganda is positive. We could talk about that a little more detail. The reality is harsh, and reality wins. And there's a very good book on this by Robert Shiller, Nobel Prize-winning economist at Yale University. Not a huge fan of your garden variety PhD economists, but there are some good ones out there, and he's one of them. He wrote a book about, 2 years ago, maybe a little bit less, called Narrative Economics. He said, yeah, we got all the models in Phillips curve and wealth effect and various quantity theory of money, and some have a place, some are more valuable than others. But don't underestimate the power of a narrative. A narrative is a story. It's a fancy name for a story, but a story that persists, that grows. And interestingly, in epidemiology, of course, we've just come through a pandemic. There's a model called the SIRE model that stands for susceptible. Are you susceptible to a virus? E for exposed. Are you exposed to it? I, are you infected? Did you get it? And R, did you recover? The difference between I and R are people who died. But it's a model when it's mathematically based and it's empirically validated of how viruses spread exponentially. And you can also use it to forecast how a virus is going to go. Well, what Shiller did, he took that model, moved it over to economics, and took a narrative kind of like a virus, not in a negative sense, just something that spreads. And it can be very powerful. and then eventually it may die out or reverse, but it can be powerful in the meantime. That much I knew. But what I learned from the book that I hadn't really thought about is that narratives don't have to be true. They can be true, and they can be very powerful. But a narrative can be false and still be powerful. If it's the self-fulfilling prophecy, if enough people believe it, it sort of becomes the reality to some extent, even if it's based on false premises. He gives an example during the Great Depression. The Great Depression really was two technical recessions. But there was a period from 1929 to 1933, election of Franklin Don and the Roosevelt. And then there was another period from 1933 to 1937. The 37 and 1940 part we leave aside for this purpose. But during the first part of the Great Depression, unemployment was high, output was dropping, trade was dropping. It was a very, very bad time, no doubt about it. But not everybody was out of work. Not everybody was poor. There were a lot of people with a lot of money at the time, but it was felt that being ostentatious was poor form. It's like, okay, I'm lucky I have a job, I've got some money, but I'm not going to buy a new car, buy a big house, or flash it around or whatever, because it's really not considerate of all the people who actually have fallen on hard times. Well, that was the narrative. But it's the worst possible economic advice because it's precisely the fact that people with the money should keep spending. That kind of can boost the economy out of a depression. So by people saying, well, even though I have the money, I'm not going to spend it because it's poor form, we're actually prolonging the Great Depression. Now, when FDR came along, was elected in 1933, became president, 34, the psychology turned 180 degrees, and all of a sudden, the Democratic campaign song was Happy Days Are Here Again, and FDR seemed to solve the banking crisis and so forth. And all of a sudden, it became okay to spend money. Well, in the middle of the Great Depression, 1934 to 1936, those were some of the strongest years ever for the stock market, and unemployment did come down a lot. Now, the problem is it came down from like 25% to 15%, while 15% is still painfully high. But it was a big move in the right direction. So he describes how the narrative flipped from don't spend money, it's poor form, to, yeah, go spend money and help the economy. None of that is taught in business school. It's not taught in economics. It can be modeled using this epidemiology model, but it doesn't fit into any of the standard macroeconomic models. But it's powerful stuff. And so today what's going on is that the White House is trying to push a narrative, and they're failing badly. But they'll say, if you listen to deliberations among White House officials, some of the stuff leaks to the press. And I know some of these people. It's like the economy is great. Unemployment is really low. We've created all these jobs since the pandemic. But we're doing a really bad job of messaging. The point is, they're inside the White House. They're frustrated that the positive economic story is not getting out the correct analysis, is that there is no positive economic story. The economy is in terrible shape. The problem is not the messaging, it's the message. And this is why I say the propaganda from the White House, if things are great, is at ODs with the reality, which is things are not great. Let me give you some specific data points, because, as I say, I don't like to make statements like this without backing it up. Number one, the inflation was going up long before the war in Ukraine started. So if everything was great until February 27, and then Russia invades, and then all of a sudden the inflation goes up, all right, let's talk about it. But that's not true. This inflation goes back to late 2021. It was persistent in the fall. We all remember the Fed and the Treasury saying transitory, transitory, transitory. And then finally, Jay Powell was testifying before Congress. He said it's time to retire the word transitory. So that was his way of throwing in the towel. And Janet Yellen admitted she was mistaken also. So it predates the war. Number one. Energy prices are going up because there's a war with Russia. Well, I wonder why that is. Well, the reason is not because Putin invaded Ukraine. It's because the US counterattacked with financial sanctions. Now, bear in mind, go back to January 21st, 2021, when Biden was sworn in as president and then went back to the White House. What was the first thing he did? He closed the Keystone XL pipeline. This is a pipeline that would bring oil from Alberta, Canada, into the United States, where it would connect at a hub. I believe it's in Kansas, but somewhere in the central United States. Then the hub distributes it to the entire country. So he shut down that pipeline, which curtailed the supply of oil from Canada, then ended new leasing, oil and gas exploration, leasing on federal lands. Handicapped. The fracking industry took a number of other steps using environmental tools, climate alarm, government subsidies, etc., to the extent possible. Shut down the US energy industry as much as possible. Now, you can't shut down completely, of course, but everything happens at the margin. And then we end up with oil prices doubling or tripling, really from $40 to $120 in under a year, which is comparable to what happened in 1973 with the Arab oil embargo. And then Biden wakes up and says, guess we need more oil. And so he wants to reopen leasing. I said they shut down. They did, but he wants to reopen it. He's begging Saudi Arabia to pump more. Saudi Arabia is kind of not returning his phone calls. He's begging Venezuela to pump more. Oh, great. The greatest pariah dictator in the Western Hemisphere, and we're begging him for oil. Say, why don't we drill our own oil? Because we were a net exporter up until 2021. And then Biden came in and we lost that edge and became a net importer, including recently buying oil from Russia. They curtailed that for political reasons, but that's kind of where we got to. So you wonder why the price of energy is going up. In other words, this damage was self-inflicted. But don't be misled by the headlines, because they're, again, this narrative. I think I can keep this brief in the sense that a lot of what's going to affect the stock market is the geopolitical situation. So we talked about that in depth. But if you're just buying the S&P 500 index from Vanguard or Fidelity, and it's been going up. And it has been going up. There's no question about that. And you're like, I'll just sit there and watch it go up. Be careful. We've been warning about a stock market decline for a long time. It's happening. I mean, by the way, the NASDAQ people forget this because Wall Street is out to sell your stocks. And CNBC says up. The NASDAQ peaked in November 2021. Go look at a 3-year chart and say what was the all-time high of NASDAQ. It was November 2021, and it's been down ever since. Now, it went down and came back, and it's going down again. Okay, there's volatility. And if you're a day trader, fine, good for you. Good luck trying to pick the spots. But the fact is, it's been going down for almost 2 years, and it's going down pretty heavily now because the error is out of the tech balloon. There's nothing I see that's going to make that better. I don't think the Fed's done raising interest rates. We'll talk more next week about what could happen. Yeah, and I remember the 1970s. The stock market peaked. Dow Jones peaked in 1969. It didn't get back to that peak until 1982. Now, okay, 1982 was the beginning of one of the greatest bull markets in history. Grant that. But 82 is 13 years. It went sideways. Now, again, there's volatility in dips and peaks. I'm not saying you can't make money, but I'm saying that there's a 13-year period when the stock market ended up where it started. Number one, around 1,000 on the Dow. And when you adjust for inflation, because we had massive inflation in the late 1970s, it was still down. So that's 13 years. Well, we're 2 years into this dip, and the NASDAQ is nowhere near where it was 2 years ago. That's the first thing that's going to get worse because the US is heading into a recession, and we may be in a recession. Everyone's like, wait a second. Yesterday, GDP was up 5%, and that was the number. It was the first government estimate for the third quarter of 2023. It was up 5%, but it was very heavy on consumption and very heavy on inventory. So when those two things, well, consumption, obviously, people don't realize when wholesalers and distributors build up inventory. That counts as GDP. Well, it's fine to build up inventory if people are buying the stuff, but if they don't buy the stuff and you're up to the rafters in inventory, you got to start writing it down. This is where you go to the Gap and you get like 10 shirts and 5 pairs of jeans for $30. I mean, this is what happens. They slash prices. They do 2-for-1 sales. They just move the merchandise. And particularly in certain areas, stuff goes out of style. And the fashion industry is notorious. Who wants last year's coat or whatever? So then the inventory situation comes down to the consumer. Are people buying stuff? It looks like the consumer hit the brakes in August. Now, the second quarter is July, August, September, sometime around mid to late August, after 2 pretty strong months. And they were strong. The consumers just hit the brakes. Now, they had done enough to make the third quarter strong. But going into the fourth quarter, they may just not show up for the game. A couple of reasons for that. You go back to 2020, 2021, what was going on? Well, starting with Trump in, I think, June 2020, he gave everybody a $1,400 check. If you got a heartbeat, you got a check. And then Trump did it again in December, just before he left office. It was another $600 check. Biden comes in and says, well, I can top that. And Biden does in February 2021, right after he was sworn in. Here comes another $1,600 check. And then there was Build Back Better, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually the greenest scam. We were spending not spending. We were running deficits of $2 trillion a year for about 4 or 5 years. The total spending was higher than that. But the deficit alone was about $2 trillion. A no Nancy Pelosi handing out money. Well, the Americans got used to that. Thanks for the check. And then there was a deferment on student loans. You didn't have to pay your student loans for about at least 2 years, maybe a little bit longer. And then when people got those checks, they saved a lot of it. So what happened in 2023? People drew down their savings. The savings rate got really low, like 3%. It was up around 13% during the pandemic. It's about a little over 3%, 3.5% right now, which is low. They spent the savings they had, they didn't make new savings, and then they turned to the credit cards and ran up their credit card balances. Well, that feels good for a while. But then if you're paying the minimum and rolling over the balance and you're at your limit, your credit limit is used up and the interest rates are 20%. Some of them are 28%. You're going to double that balance in 3 years. If you're like, I'll just pay the minimum this month and I'll figure it out, your balance is going up because the interest is compounding faster than you're paying it down at 5%. So people are tapped down on their credit cards. They've used up their savings. They're getting into a deeper hole because the interest is compounding faster than they can pay off the credit cards, and they're just backing away. And it's showing up in things like gasoline consumption. It's way down. Gasoline is what economists call the demand for gasoline is what economists call inelastic, meaning you just have to buy it no matter what the price is. You got to take the kids to school or get to work or go shut whatever it is. You're just going to buy the gasoline, even if you don't like the price. By the way, lately price has been coming down a little bit, which is that sounds good, but it's actually a bad sign because it's disinflationary, which kind of leans in the direction of a recession. But for gasoline consumption to drop, forgetting about the price, that means people are not driving. They're not going on vacation. They're not doing road trips. They're not driving any more than they have to. There are a lot of other signs. We don't have time to get into all the technicals with negative swap spreads and inverted yield curves and all the rest. But it does look like the consumer slammed on the brakes around late August, early September. The fourth quarter could be a disaster. The stock market is starting to wake up to that fact. So I would say it's a pretty simple recommendation, Matt. Reduce your exposure